Colour is a powerful tool in photography. It can bring life to a photograph, enhance emotion, direct focus, or be the subject in itself. Colours close to each other on the colour wheel can create a harmonic, peaceful mood, while combining colours opposite on the wheel creates contrast. Red is the most visceral, evocative colour. Yellow is psychologically the happiest colour, evoking warmth and joy. Blue is cool, which can be relaxed, introspective, or moody. Green is calm, natural, peaceful. There are some mechanisms within colour use in photography that can be really valuable to understand and utilise. First, we have tonal contrast. It can create a really compelling dynamic to include contrast of two tones. For instance, cool and warm is something you often see in films, particularly a strong contrast between blues and yellows. The first photograph we have to demonstrate this is this image by Julie Falk, in which a strong combination of yellow and blue draws our eye inwards to the central yellow area and evokes a strong sensory experience of colour. This composition also works well due to the leading lines of the petals in towards the focal point. The next photograph is this image by Grant Ritchie, in which it's not so much about two opposing tones but more about colour contrast within the image in general. This is a valuable way to highlight the subject, especially within things like adventure photography where you might have a small person within a large landscape. It's good to be able to have the person wearing a bright or contrasting colour so that they stand out. Red tends to work well for most landscapes. This composition is simple and effective. The mountain has been captured with a near-far approach that draws us inwards along the mountain ridge to connect with the person and then onwards to the point, creating a good visual narrative. And finally, we have this photo by Cat Love. It's just as much about light and shadow as it is about tonal contrast. I love the balance that she has achieved in this portrait, the way the woman intersects the blocks of background colour, pulling the pink tone across into the blue. Colour is such a strong determinant of the interest and success in this image, so it's always valuable to be aware of colour and how it interacts. Colour can be used to highlight subjects in many ways. Obviously, making the subject a contrasting colour does that, but here is another method. This photo by Alicia Aston shows how colour can be used to frame the subject, especially if the subject is lacking much colour interest. I really like the use of texture in this image, but we will touch on that more when we get to the food photography section. Limited palette or monochrome photography can be a really powerful tool at simplifying images and therefore adding to their impact or their feeling of cohesiveness within the image. This photo by Alex Chewton is a good example of one colour photography. When the palette is limited like this, it turns the landscape into something almost surreal. I think a really important aspect of monochrome photographs is having a good tonal range. This offers depth and shape, making a more complete and interesting image. So look out to include those darks and lights. This photograph by Nicola Fioravanti is a good example of limited colour palette. We have a few shades of grey-brown, white and black. Limited colours like this allow you to simplify the photo and therefore focus on other details. It also creates a uniformity, cohesiveness and feeling of intention within the photograph. The figure of the person in this photo is so crucial, otherwise we would have no perception that this is a space or the scale of it. Lastly, we have this photograph by Brooke Lark, which is another example of limited palette, but also of colour repetition and complementary colour, which are valuable mechanisms to consider for any photography and are particularly successful in food photography. What otherwise might be a flat composition now has elements to jump around. In this photo it creates pattern and aesthetic appeal, which enhances the focal point of the pineapple, and soft natural light creates subtle dimension. Black and white photography truly simplifies photos and allows focus to go to details, patterns, textures and form. It also adds drama and can add to the seriousness of moods which bright or warm colours would distract from. Black and white is an intensification and purification of the psychological experience. It can add a sense of timelessness and cohesion across a body of work. Black and white images, like colour-based monochrome, generally rely on some strong tonal contrast, real blacks and real whites. Practicing black and white photography can be a good way to study observing light and form, because these become forefront. To start with, we have this black and white portrait by Leroy Skalstad, which allows us to connect more deeply to the eyes and features of the face through having it monochromatic. Directional light sculpts the features and gives dimension. The hood creates another dimensional element and frames the image so that the face is the only focal point to engage with. Next, we have this landscape image by Jerome Prax, in which a beautiful tonal range really suits the black and white render. This would have been a completely different and, in my opinion, lesser image if the sky had been blue behind. Colour would have only detracted. But by being black and white, we focus on the shape and light. We are drawn by these two bands of light to the tip of the mountain, where snow is being blown off, forming another light band. And lastly, we have this photo by Robert Mapplethorpe. What I think is so successful in this image is the clean separation of limited tones that heavily contrast. This gives strong focus to shape and balance within the image. Her dress leads us up to her face, the buttons creating a trail up her dress. This photo really illustrates the timeless feel of black and white photography. It's worth noting that a good white balance is a crucial aspect of colour within successful photos. It can be quite jarring if white balance is off. Auto white balance settings within the camera can do a pretty good job, but in some situations, like a brilliant sunset, you may need to manually set the Kelvin numbers to get a more accurate representation of the scene. By learning some sense of Kelvin numbers, you'll be able to have a fiddle in different environments to get your camera capturing a closer representation to reality. But mostly white balance can be fixed in any editing software pretty easily. I often find that scenes with lots of green colour and not much natural light veer towards a yellow tinge. It's simple to correct this by making the image slightly more blue, which creates a more aesthetically pleasing photograph. So that concludes colour. I hope this section has inspired more awareness of colour and understanding of how it can be harnessed. I have found limiting my colour palette in photography has made me a lot more aware of colour, so it may be useful to challenge yourself in this way. The next section is composition.